Gary Hutch is born in 1981 and he is born to Patsy and Kay Hutch into the North Inner City. He is second, I think, in a family of five, and he's an older brother, Del Boy, a younger brother, Jordan, and a younger brother, Patrick, and a sister, Lindsay. Big enough family.
Big enough family.
But sort of, I suppose, where do they sit, and is there a wider family of Hutches? You know, what were the parents' generation like?
Well, of course, the Hutches are a big presence in the North Inner City. Of course, Gerry Hutch, who's been on this podcast, would be, one of the best known people in this country probably at this stage. And he was the sixth oldest of 8 children born to Patrick and Julia Hutch, Patrick known as Masher. And they were raised in the North Inner City at a particular time in Dublin's history. They were Gerry Hutch and his family were raised in what was known as the Corporation Buildings, just off Foley Street here. It would have been one of those purpose-built kind of flat complexes. People were moved out of the tenements, of course, around the beginning of the 20th century. Ireland was one of the last places that had people living in these single rooms in old Georgian houses. I mean, it happened throughout the UK, but eventually the authorities made the decision to clear them, and they were placed in these flat complexes. So it would have been all 8 raised in a 1-bedroom flat, basically. And by the time,
talk to us about the poverty.
Well, it was, I suppose, even in it was post-war. Of course, Ireland was not the thriving place it would become. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, there was still a lot of rationing, but Ireland went through a very, very difficult time economically, and the place that experienced the worst of that would have been the North Inner City in particular. There would have been huge rates of unemployment. Even by European standards at the time, it would have been an extremely poor part. And I think at the time of Jared's birth, there would have been unemployment something like 20-30% in that particular area. So people would have been living hand to mouth. There was a mix as well then, of course, of people being crowded in on top of each other. We look back on it now and say that's the worst way to, that's the way to breed poverty and crime, is to put people in poor accommodation with very little services. So you're talking about a time where, as Jared was growing up and his brothers and sisters, they probably would have been hungry. And he's described being hungry. Getting a meal at the end of the day was not automatic. And in the middle of all of that, in the 1960s, there was a general turmoil within the world, I suppose. Things rapidly changed, but they changed slower in Ireland and in that part of the city in particular.
So how did he feed himself?
Well,
I mean, some like Gerard Hutch and obviously Patsy Hutch, who would be the father of Gary Hutch.
Yeah.
So they're and all the uncles is what? There's Johnny, Eddie.
Yeah, so
Derek, known as Del Boy.
There was 3 sisters, Margaret, Tina and Sandra. But there was 5 boys, John, or Johnny as he became known, Derek, who became known as Del Boy Senior, Eddie, who was also known as Neddy, John and Gerard. And those brothers would have all got in legal trouble from a really, really young age. So when we had him on the podcast, Gerry Hutch spoke about being arrested at the age of 8 for robbing lemonade. And I suppose it was the first wave of that kind of crime was starting to occur in Dublin's North Inner City. You know, back during the World War II in the 50s, crime of robbery and theft was really quite at a minimum. So people, he grew up in that culture. There was also a culture of truancy, people not going to school. Obviously, there was very high rates of alcoholism and things like that, not in his family in particular, but in the local area. And people, he grew up around a group of young people that robbery was second nature. It was a way to feed yourself.
So, I mean, Gerard goes into what we know to be the Bugsy Malones, and that's sort of the first thing that he becomes famous for. Now, he's very close with Patsy Hutch, Gary's father, and with Eddie and his other brothers, but he certainly is the one that comes out of it as being the sort of the leader of those Bugsy Malones.
So the Bugsy Malones, which we have spoken about before, but just to remind people what they were. So, you know, if there was a time in Ireland's history, I think it was in the late 60s, there's a famous report where some Garda declares organised crime doesn't happen in Ireland. Like, it's not an issue. Because there wasn't really any at that stage. But what you did have in this melting pot that eventually occurred in Dublin's north inner city, you had shortly after that a group of young teenagers, really between the ages of 10 and 18, who were behind this first wave of, I suppose, really of disorganised crime. So they were not going to school. They were involved in robberies, and as they got through the teenage years, it escalated into two sort of new waves of crime. One of them was joyriding, which hadn't really been seen in Ireland. Obviously, joyriding involves just stealing cars, and really, instead of stealing them to sell them, it was just to drive around the city, get involved in a bit of chaos. And the other thing were these jump-over crimes where young lads run into a shop, basically jump over the counter and grab open the till and grab what they can. And this was a new phenomenon. And they got dubbed the Bugsy Malones because there was a film, a musical out about where there was a group of teenage or even younger kids basically playing mobsters in America, a musical, a kind of a very cheery kind of film, I suppose, despite its subject matter. And the Bugsy Malones got hit with that moniker. And they became, I suppose, the first celebrity crime?
Well, they became headline news, didn't they? I mean, there was even a story that was mentioned about them going on holidays with their funds. They went out to the Dublin airport to go on holidays to Spain or something, which I think was pretty wrong story. I think it was a kind of a, some sort of a tour group organised by community groups within the North Inner City for kids, and but they still made the front pages.
Yeah, it did. They became depending on your perspective, because Ireland hadn't had that type of crime. And remember, we're talking about the Bugsy Malones, which really was a reference to what had happened in America through the 20s and the 30s, through Prohibition, when the mafia had started to come and organised, like, criminality was on the streets and became normalised. It hadn't happened in Ireland until then. So they caused what some people describe as a moral panic, as in the country is going to the dogs. This is shocking that young people are involved in this kind of reckless crime, and it generated huge media attention. And so RTE went down, all the newspapers went down, and of course, one of the things that survives all of that moral panic is Gary Hutch being interviewed, of course. And he says, and I'll read it out for you, at one point he's been asked about the Bugsy Malones, and he says, "I can't give up robbing. If I see money in a car, I'm taking it. I can't just leave it there. If I see a handbag on a seat, I'll smash the window and be away before anyone knows what's going on. I don't go near people walking along the street. They don't have any money on them. They're not worth robbing." And so he describes all of this. I think he's roughly 14 years old. So it becomes this huge issue. Even the Minister for Defence speaks about it, about how these young people are cocking their nose at Gardaí and walking around fearless. And of course, there becomes a crackdown. Most of these people, Gary Hutch included, ultimately end up in juvenile detention, which is a very brutal system. It's not really juvenile detention. They're being put in adult jails. And, there's no doubt this entrenches them even further in criminality. Now, even at this point, people will describe Gerry Hutch as sort of emerging as a bit of a different figure than the others, a bit more cool and calculated, a bit more intelligent. And of course, he does have his older brothers there, in particular Eddie, or Neddy, as he was known, who's a couple of years older than him. When Gerry Hutch does end up in these jails, Eddie looks after him. Eddie is kind of a mentor figure. But of course, Patsy as well is also there. And Patsy and Eddie both amass a huge amount of convictions as young men. And the Hutches as a grouping, and of course other wider relatives, but they become very much known and a force to be reckoned with.
And I suppose that brings us up to sort of the 1983. So Gary Hutch is only 2, he's a toddler, and his uncle Gerry, only 20 years of age, has at this point got 30 convictions, and he basically goes to jail for malicious damage in 1983. But you have a whole lot of other things going on there that are going to define this young, then toddler Gary Hutch.
Yes, so there is absolutely a couple of things going on. One of them being that both Gerard and Patsy are at that stage, they're becoming young men. And I think both of them realise after they both have amassed about 25 convictions, 30 convictions at that stage for a range of serious and not so serious crimes. And at that point, both of them seem to realise that that's not the route to go. Patsy's last criminal conviction is in 1982, and Gerard Hutch also ends up in prison in or around the same time, maybe 1983. And that brings, I suppose, an end to one side of his criminal career, which is that kind of disorganised, low-scale robbery and getting caught. They graduate, I think, is the way to describe it. And when, at that point, Dublin, of course, is undergoing a lot of changes. The 70s are over, and we're going into the 80s, which would be, still a very difficult time in Ireland, but certainly a very different phase, I suppose, in the North Inner City at that time. How would you describe, I suppose, that environment that he's coming out into then in the early 80s?
Well, I suppose we have at the same time that Gary Hutch is born, and I suppose, and that Eddie and Johnny, etc., are all having their kids. They have their kids young. Yeah. In their 20s, they start their families. Yeah. And that creates a new band of brothers, but they're a band of cousins, aren't they?
Yeah.
And they're very much in that sort of Irish Dublin style. They spend a lot of time together. But outside the homes of the Hutches and the kids, are on the streets of Dublin, there is probably what is one of the greatest social issues of our time is happening, and that's heroin.
Yeah.
So for a tiny little bit of background to that, it's first been introduced to Dublin by an industrious criminal called Larry Dunn in the late 1970s. It doesn't take long for heroin to take hold. It shows up first in the north and south inner cities and quickly sort of spreads its tentacles outwards. Now, we know what happened with heroin. I mean, this is slightly what happens in Dublin and what happens in other cities, including Liverpool, is sort of a ripple effect from a situation where you have the sort of the revolution in Iran. And what happens there is you have the kind of like wealthy business people are fleeing the country after this revolution. They can't bring their cash out, so they exchange their cash for heroin. They come to Europe as the Ayatollah Khomeini overthrows the Shah. They come to Europe with the heroin and they exchange it back into cash. And that's really what happens. And that's how the heroin makes its way into the European market proper. I mean, there has been opium back in the day, and heroin and opium are the same product. But opium was something that way back was used in opium dens and by poets and by artists and the rich.
Bohemian circles in Dublin. I mean, the idea, it was never a working class drug up until this point.
Well, Larry Dunn makes it a working class drug, and very quickly, and he doesn't have to push it too hard. I mean, there is all sorts of stories about Dunn and his grouping handing it out for free, people becoming very quickly addicted to it. You have a lot of unemployment going on. There's a lot of deprivation, and heroin is like sort of a warm hug, and it makes people feel good for a while, and they quickly become these sort of populations of vast, where there's vast employment for the working classes, where a lot of hope has gone. They quickly become addicted to it. And out of that, you have, I mean, literally as Gary Hutch is being born, by the time he is born, from the late 1970s to then, we have an epidemic, the first epidemic on the streets of Dublin and largely around his neighbourhood. Locals are concerned and they sort of come together in response to this flood of smack that's coming in, and that's what it was described as at the time, smack. And out of desperation, they kind of come together and start to try and fight back. Now, to show you how big the problem was, in 1983, there was a study released called the Bradshaw Report. And it found that in one area of Dublin, which is exactly right near where a lot of the Hutches were growing up and were having their children, it was an area that it was a study that concentrated around Sean McDermott Street. And it found that 15% of young people under the age of 25 were taking heroin.
Yeah.
Now, most people who take heroin become addicted.
Yeah.
Like, that's a huge swathe of the young population. It was being taken at a time, of course, that there was an AIDS epidemic as well.
There was.
And, you know, the needles were transmitting that from one to the other of them.
Yeah,
so it was bad.
I mean, it was a shock as well. You have to understand that people probably didn't understand the long-term consequences of what heroin would do. So people were trying it, and there was incredible statistics about the age profile of people taking it so young.
Yeah,
and it was such a rapid. It was so rapid, and the state was ill prepared to cope with it in any way.
And completely. And those statistics alone proved that North Inner City Dublin had a bigger problem at that point than New York's Harlem.
Mm.
You know, Harlem was actually moving from it through the 70s, had a heroin problem, and it was moving towards crack cocaine. Not saying that's better, but, you know, at that point in time, Dublin's North Inner City had a bigger problem than what was seen as, you know, the worst drug-ravaged place in the world. So, and there in the mix of everybody, you had this politician called Tony Gregory, who had been elected in 1982 in what was known as Gregory's deal. He found himself in this brilliant position that he was able to negotiate sort of a capital investment into the constituency because he agreed to nominate Charles Haughey as Taoiseach. But Gregory was somebody who was rarely out of the public eye. He has been described as vehemently anti-drugs. He would correct people when he was still alive to say he was not anti-drugs, he was anti-heroin. And in actual fact, he makes a very interesting point at the end of his life when he does an interview with Hot Press and he's reflecting back on all of this. And he says that, you know, he really points out that he was anti-heroin, not anti-drugs, because if he was anti-drugs, then he wouldn't have been able to take his caffeine and his alcohol. And in actual fact, he says he believes in hindsight that alcohol had a far worse effect on his constituency than anything else, which is maybe something we'll come back to. But he did care deeply about sort of the ordinary working classes. Gregory had a better upbringing than the Hutches. Both his parents worked and they actually bought a house. He was educated, went to college. But he did play a very influential role in those anti-drugs campaigns of the mid-80s. And he's quoted as saying in the Hot Press interview, there was spontaneous community response to heroin. Not to drugs, but to heroin, in an area that had never experienced anything like that, but had every other sort of problem. We had massive unemployment, awful housing conditions, no maintenance from the local authority, very few getting beyond primary education. And then suddenly there were these people from within the community giving 12-year-olds heroin, and they were mainlining heroin. And people living within the area, both in the 80s and in the 90s, there was a coach in the local boxing club, a footballer, an athlete who were all known and respected for their sporting activities within the community. And they were supplying the heroin. And some of those characters we will come to later. And they are all the characters really of Gary Hutch's childhood. They're the sort of people that these community representatives were trying to run out of the community. So the Concerned Parents Against Drugs movement proper was officially born in 1984. And it started in that North Inner City at the Hardwicke Street flat complex, where a Jesuit priest actually brought together the community and asked them, you know, what are we going to do? How are we going to respond to this? We need to have meetings in the open air to discuss this heroin problem. And Hardwicke Street, of course, was at that point, a drug supermarket practically. So it quickly spread across the country, across the city rather, and into other badly affected complexes. And there was very colourful characters involved, including John Whacker Humphreys, who was known as one of the founding members. I think he was from the Hardwick Street Flats area, where there was actually listed as up to 200 addicts a day going in to get their fix into that small sort of flat complex. You spoke about Gary Hutch doing an interview on RTE. There's reports like back in the archives in RTE, and if you go in and you see them interviewing these community activists, I find it intriguing and almost quaint when you know what's happened with drugs, because they're speaking about how they're going to push the pushers out, and that's going to solve the problem.
Yeah, because of course the drugs were being sold on the stairwells of these inner city flat complexes. I mean, literally people were standing there and selling them out. And of course they did manage to push them out, but it didn't, it just moved it a couple of 100 metres down the road.
Nobody knew the power of heroin, I think. You know, it was so new, and people didn't realise that community spirit wasn't a force against heroin.
Yeah.
And it was because of all that was going on in the background that, you know, it did become so used, really. So, you know, marches were organised around various people identified. Their homes were targeted. Tony King Scum Filoni was a big name from that period, and he was nicknamed, I think, by the media because he turned it into a family business, the sale of heroin, and got a lot of his own children addicted so as they would continue working for him, basically. But he was targeted and put under a lot of pressure by the CPAD. And it really ultimately resulted in the Gardaí setting up the first undercover detective unit known as the Mockies, who were out to, like, up until this point, we didn't have a drugs unit. So they were the first kind of unit, and obviously Larry Dunn in particular was targeted by them. He was a big political figure at that stage. He had lived up in the Dublin mountains and, you know, been driven around in a chauffeur-driven car around Dublin and had really spent his money. Like, as Gary Hutch was going into prison in 1983, he was put on trial, Larry Dunn. It was to be the end of his era. He actually absconded from the courts and was arrested 2 years later in Portugal as Gary Hutch was leaving jail again. But, you know, articles that are online and that you can find in the archives about them show these very highly charged marches on the homes of suspected dealers. They were loud, they were noisy, they sometimes worked. You know, Filoni was ultimately targeted by both the community groups and the police. He was found to have had €100,000 worth of heroin in his flat, and he had money hidden in a black sock out in the garden. He got 10 years ultimately. And there was another incident outside Thomas Boxer Mullen's house. Now, he was who I think Gregory was referring to as the boxing coach. Very well-known sportsman, plus a well-known heroin addict. And the community groups actually came and placed a coffin outside his house. And he was named in the Dáil by Gregory as a heroin addict. So this was really lively times as such for you growing up as a kid, that you wouldn't have been able to miss it. And I think that Gary Hutch, when he's eventually released from prison around 1985, and other members of the Hutch family were prominent supporters of this Concerned Parents Against Drugs. They were often on the marches, and they were very vocal about getting heroin out of their community.
So the marches against the community marches against the heroin dealers was a very complex thing, because while everybody in theory agreed that heroin dealers are bad, the state and the establishment also looked down on those groups as well, for various reasons. But one of them was the fact that while these groupings would target heroin dealers, people like Gary Hutch, they were allowed to be a part of it as well, and the establishment didn't like that. Gary Hutch had gone into prison, as you said, in 1983, but before that, in the early 80s, when he was probably around 17, 18, he had been taken under the wing of a guy called Eamon Kelly. Now, Eamon Kelly would stay involved in organised crime for another 3 decades until he was ultimately shot dead by the real IRA. But Eamon Kelly at the time was, there was the Duns, there was the Cahills, and then there was the Kelly gang. They were regarded as the big 3 criminal organisations in the state. Eamon Kelly was born in 1946. He had an older brother, Matt, who he was very close to, a partner in crime all through his career. And he was one of these first wave of organised criminals to emerge. Now, they emerged in part through what would be, I suppose, the paramilitary structures that existed. As the 70s kicked off, the Troubles began. Mm-hmm. And the Troubles started really, really quickly. And by the early 70s, I mean, there was a huge amount of weapons imported into the state. You had a constant stream of bank robberies. The country was at war effectively up across the border, and that it changed things below the border as well. They were always said that the birth of organised crime comes from a robbery by Sarah Era, which were an unusual group that were kind of paid, I suppose, sort of Republican, but basically just a group of armed robbers, and would have included people like Christy Dunn, Larry Dunn's brother. But Eamon Kelly was on the edges of that organisation. And as the 1970s went on, there was a split in the IRA between 2 factions, the Provisional IRA and the Official IRA. The Provisional IRA were really a northern-based organisation initially, mostly around Belfast. They were far more determined to take the British state directly on. The Official IRA were a leftist organisation, really, who ultimately had a different perspective. But that split was very serious. Eamon Kelly would have sided with the Official IRA, and the Official IRA ultimately would declare a ceasefire. But it was a very unusual situation developed where the Official IRA, while they in theory were retired and moved into politics, they had an operation called the Group B. It was called Group B. They have documents and everything have been said. And they were funding the political operation, which ultimately will become the Workers' Party, mostly through bank robberies. And Eamon Kelly, while he's often described as being a member of the Official IRA, he probably wasn't. Mm-hmm. But the Official IRA were running these bank robbery squads, and they were amongst the biggest operators all through the 1970s. And what they would do would be they would provide information, weaponry, intelligence, all of that, and people like Eamon Kelly, and ultimately Gary Hutch would carry them out, and there would be a deal done. So Eamon Kelly also has connections, does he not, with the INLA, and was ultimately one of the best friends of the famous Desi O'Hare, border fox. It was again a very complicated situation, because other people that Eamon Kelly would have been dealing with were people like Thomas the Zombie Savage, who was again in and out on the edges of the INLA. But what Eamon Kelly had was, as Gary Hutch is coming out of prison, he had a massive protection operation going on in the city, which is effectively doesn't exist anymore. But it was targeting ordinary businesses. People have to pay protection money, or they'd be they suffer violence. But he was also involved on the edges of drug dealing. And as you get into the 1980s, Gary Hutch is brought into that organisation. And
he's seen as probably by Kelly a upcoming
100%.
It's going to be a success.
Yeah. And
Kelly's not going to mentor somebody who isn't going to be long in the business. So he obviously sees his skills and his talents.
Well, in 1982, there's a Garda report. A few years before, Eamon Kelly is described as having a ruthlessness, a cunning and vicious individual. This is in another Garda report. Is something of a godfather status among his associates. But in 1982, there's also a report on Gary Hutch done up in connection with a shooting that has gone on. And the guards say Gerry Hutch is full-time involved in the organisation of major crime and is actively involved in the commissioning of these crimes. It is stated that he has access to a wide range of weaponry and would not hesitate to use it if confronted. Over the years, there are many sightings of himself, Kelly and other hardcore criminals together. Although of tender years, Gerry Hutch is much respected and feared by the criminal element on account of his previous exploits and violent disposition. And so that reputation is starting to be built in the early 80s. And some of that reputation, or much of that reputation, comes from a number of murders that occur in the city. Now, Gerry Hutch has always denied involvement in some of these murders. He's always
remained suspected of involvement in them as well. He denies,
but what happened was, and this is in, so you can say, when is the first gangland murder in Ireland?
Yeah, when is it?
Well, I'm going to tell you, because it wouldn't make for a good podcast if I didn't. But there is a bit of dispute about, what would be regarded as the first gangland murder, because there was, for example, there's one in 1979, a guy called Basil English is shot dead in an assassination in Ballymun Flats. But really, ultimately, it's not a gangland feud. It's a personal dispute with other criminals.
With the use of weaponry.
With the use of
coming through the paramilitary.
That
new sort of breed of organised criminal.
Exactly. But you could say, if you can pick on the murder of a guy called Gerry Horgan in Ballymun in 1983, and that is one of the first ever, person to be assassinated over a drug feud.
Right.
No personal motive or beyond the normal personal motive. And Gerry Horgan was selling hash, really, for a guy called Dave Myler Brogan. Dave Myler Brogan would have been about a decade older than Gerry Hutch, but he would have been involved in a number of robberies with Gerry Hutch. Bank robberies, he would have, there was one occasion where Gerry Hutch is suspected of driving in on a motorbike and robbing a shop, and Brogan would have been involved in all of this, but he kind of moved into the drugs trade in Ballymun, and he had this guy Horgan working for him. At one point, Myler flies over to France, he's arrested, and Horgan tries to take over his patch, basically. Now, Myler is involved with one guy in particular, Thomas the Zombie Savage, who's a very close pal of Gerry Hutch's. The word gets back to Horgan, this isn't okay. He goes on a bit of he sort of pushes back against it. And he goes out to Swords one night looking for the Zombie Savage. And ultimately, he is shot dead on April 1983, coming out of a flat in Ballymun. Now, Gerry Hutch's gang are all in the middle of that.
At which point Gerry Hutch is in prison?
But the gang is in the middle of it, which is
his wider associates,
Brogan and Zombie Savage. So this all comes on the back in a few months earlier, in May 1982, a guy called Gerard Morgan is shot dead. He is 15 years old, and he's shot dead in a case of a mistaken identity. He's basically mistaken for his brother. He's shot through the front door. Very, very big news story.
Is this in Ballymun?
No, this one is in Crumlin. And it's a very big story at the time, very rare. But basically, Alan Morgan, his brother, was suspected of not handing over proceeds of a robbery that was also carried out by the Hutch organisation. And he was asked to get the money. It wasn't handed back to him, and his brother is shot dead. Ultimately, a couple of people will go to prison.
So can I ask, are the Hutch organisation recognised as existing at this time, or is Gerard Hutch working with the Kelly organisation?
He is working with the Kelly organisation.
And associates of his are working with the Kelly organisation. They're younger, so they're not an established criminal organisation of their own as of yet.
No, they are part of the Kelly organisation. Yeah. Gerry, John and Neddy had all at some point worked for the Kellys in their carpet business. Yeah. Even as young people, they were absolutely hand in glove with them.
And Hutch had as well.
And Patsy Hutch had as well. But they were also carrying out these robberies, some of them with that Myler Brogan. and they're part of the Kelly organisation, because ultimately both Gerard Hutch and Eamon Kelly would be arrested in connection with the murder of Gerard Morgan, the 15-year-old. Now, they are not suspected of being the shooters, but they are suspected of going looking for that money to be returned. Ultimately, a couple of people would go to jail for that murder. So they are put in the mix for that. The organisation is put in the mix for the Jerry Horrigan murder. And then there is another murder that happens, a guy called Daniel McOwen in June 1983. Now, Daniel McOwen was a close associate of the Zombie Savage. He had also been in Sarah Era, had also been on the edges of the INLA, a very serious criminal, really. And he had served time for paramilitary offences, but on his release he becomes involved in the hash business, basically. Now he at some point is involved in a fight in a pub, basically, and what happens is he falls out with the Hutches, basically falls out directly with Gary Hutch, and in June 1983, McOwen, he's living in Ashburn. He's bought himself a nice house with cash, and but he still returns every week to the North Inner City to collect his dole. And as he's walking out of the dole office, he's shot 4 times. And that again is one of another, again, that is linked to the Hutch organisation. Myler Brogan would later say that Gerry Hutch was directly involved in that murder, and Eddie Hutch was acted as a spotter. Again, they were never convicted for any of those offences. So the Hutches, and Gerry Hutch in particular, are starting to develop a very serious reputation at this stage. As these murders occur, shortly after, Eamon Kelly, Gerry Hutch's great mentor, he basically gets convicted for stabbing him. It was in the Workers' Party Club on Gardiner Street. The Workers' Party Club would have been associated with the official IRA. Obviously, at that stage, Eamon Kelly is still very much part of that ecosystem. And he just gets in this sort of drunken row over a slot machine. And he stabs a guy called Patrick Kearney, relatively ordinary citizen. He initially gets 10 years, but that it gets reduced on appeal, and he goes to prison. And Eamon Kelly is then out of the mix. And at that point, Gerry Hutch basically becomes the head of his own organisation. Gary Hutch, at this point, I suppose you're talking about him being 4 or 5 years old. His father, Patsy Hutch, is not coming into the picture. He certainly seems to be living a quieter life, but Eddie and Gerard are both rising up the criminal organisation.
And they're surrounded by all of this sort of, I suppose, criminality nonetheless. You know, Gary Hutch is, and the cousins, and they are a close-knit family, all of them, and the kids won't realise what they're surrounded by, but the fact of the matter is they're surrounded by a lot of colour and a lot of very serious criminals.
Because, of course, Neddy has his own kids that are mostly slightly older than...
He also has 5.
He also has 5. But one of them in particular, Christopher Hutch, also known as Bouncer, will be very close to Gary all his life. Very much sort of seen as a mentor and a sort of, older brother type figure.
So as Kelly goes into jail, Hutch decides he's going to make some big bucks. And you're talking 1987 when he is suspected of masterminding the robbery of a Securicor van outside the Bank of Ireland at Marina Mart. The first of 2 robberies that he will later be accused of masterminding by the Criminal Assets Bureau. And at that point, there was essentially 1.35 million old pounds stolen in it. It was a huge amount of money back then. Probably 1.5 million euro or more?
More probably,
know. So in the aftermath of it, the Gardaí froze a number of bank accounts in Newry, in County Down, and they were said to be controlled by Hutch. They contained £70,000, and he challenged the seizure in the Northern Ireland courts but lost it. So his name was all over essentially this money. And it shows something that, we talk about at what point does the Hutch organised crime group emerge, really, as essentially both a family plus associates business. And it has emerged here, surely, because this is money laundering. This is effectively Hutch using contacts, connections, that the learning curve, that schooling he's got from Eamon Kelly, who has all the connections in the north of Ireland through the paramilitary groupings, who are brilliant money launderers.
Absolutely. And at this stage around Gerry Hutch, it's really a group of childhood friends, 4 or 5.
Around Gary.
Around Gerry Hutch. It's a group of 4 or 5 people. But Matt Kelly is there in the background, Eamon Kelly's brother. And not only does the money come in from the robberies, Gerry Hutch starts to invest in property.
And, as an aside, and we will be coming back to this as part of Gary Hutch's story, but that same year, 1987, Christy Kinahan, Senior, the Dapper Don, is brought before the courts for the first time, and he's charged with selling heroin. He's been caught with a consignment of heroin in a pretty snazzy flat in Clontarf in Dublin. He has seen the potential to take over Larry Dunn's business, as Dunn is jailed in 85, and he has tried and very quickly taken over a lot of it. But we're going to just park Christy Kinahan Senior there for the moment. At the same time, I suppose that the adults in the family are really kind of making their mark and going it alone, albeit with the partnership and the mentoring of the Kelly grouping. Gary Hutch is, by the sort of the 90s, even though he's only a young kid, he's 9, 10, coming up to 11, and a young teenager throughout the 90s. While there is this second wave of heroin addiction, people are kind of used to the heroin addiction now. It's part and parcel of ordinary society. Kids see the needles, they see, the addicts walking along the streets like zombies. They probably see what they don't want to be. Yeah. And yet they see these kind of, very exciting older criminals who are not taking drugs and who are not behaving like zombies, but who seem to be working the system. And there's something like that happening similar in the Crumlin area, where you have Martin, the General Cahill, and others and members of his gang seen as these very daring raiders who are stealing, fabulously expensive paintings and art and jewellery, and they're seen as sort of, almost because they grew up in these impoverished communities, they're seen as these sort of Robin Hood characters. But while I suppose the older Hutch crew, the uncles as such, and under the guidance of Gerard, are really, becoming the stuff of police reports, the younger Gary Hutch is starting very early in his teens to follow down a path as such, but in a different time, because the drugs are there. The older Hutch crew would have been out marching against them. But again, it's heroin. It's, as Tony Gregory says, this anti-drugs phenomenon is anti-heroin. It's not necessarily anti the other drugs that are about to start flooding in.
Yes, and so, I mean, the world changed, or the drugs world changed almost overnight in the early 90s. I mean, it probably hit Ireland slightly after it hit in the UK, but Ecstasy arrived. And when Ecstasy arrived, really when it hit Ireland, it was in the Mansion House. It was in a club called the Olympic. It was in a club called Sides and a club called the Asylum. So you're talking about 4 clubs maybe, and probably only the Olympic initially. And that was all in the early 90s, maybe about 1992, 93, 94. So before that, you had obviously the Gilligan gang that started to make big money selling cannabis in particular. But Ecstasy came out of nowhere. And it came out of nowhere across Europe. It was there, it was nothing. And then it was, you were talking, I think I actually watched a program recently. It said there was 1 million people taking Ecstasy every weekend in the UK, gone from 0 to 1 million in the space of a year.
And it changed the kind of outlook that people had about drugs, because where heroin was associated with this very shameful existence where you were incapable of looking after your children, where the grandparents had to step in, where people were incapable of looking after their hygiene, their health and everything else. And they were sort of, desperately looking for this drug to shoot it into their veins or smoke it or whatever way they were doing it. Ecstasy was quite cool. You were dressed up, you were out in a club, you were popping a pill, and it was the love drug, and everybody was having a great time.
Everybody was having a great time. It dragged in all sorts of people. I mean, heroin.
People who would never have taken drugs if the only option there were heroin.
Yes. So you had people from all sorts of middle class backgrounds, professional backgrounds, and you had people from the inner city flats all merging into these small handful of clubs. And there, of course, what came was there was huge money to be made. Like ecstasy tablets initially in Dublin were being sold for £20 a tablet. And that stayed. Then they were being sold for £15 for a long time. But of course they could be bought in places like Amsterdam, a wholesale at one or two quid, really, really. So there was huge money to be made. Now, at the time that this sort of revolution was occurring, Gary Hutch had been grown up in the north inner city. The club like the Asylum, they had, he might have been 14, 15 when this was at its peak.
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't, it was such a lawless environment. People like that were in clubs. And of course, people used to say, oh, that's the monk's nephew.
Yeah.
And I mean, that was just being said all over the city.
Well, he was definitely the monk by 1995, because that's, of course, when the Brinks Allied raid happened, and where he was known for the Merino Marsh. He was spoken of, whispered of, really, in circles, that weren't so public. But after this Brinks Allied raid in 95, the depot where cash was held basically had moved to Clonshock. This raid was planned months and months in advance. There had been an old farmhouse rented to store some 4x4 jeeps. The geography of the place was completely studied, and the night that was best to hit when the money had been brought in. And sure enough, eventually in the January of 1995, and there was hints that Gary Hutch was about to commit a big one.
Yeah.
But the Gardaí believed he was going to hit the Securicorps vans again. And of course, at that stage, they were being properly manned and armed. The army and the police were, moving with them until they got back to their secure units. But this robbery was so well planned that it involved makeshift bridges being made over wasteland at the back of this depot. It involved fences being cut, cars being parked up in various different places, and the gang hitting the back steel door as it literally came down to close just after the last van of the day had arrived home, and a total of about 5.6 million was in the warehouse. And at that very moment in time, just before the steel shutters went down, one of the 4x4s rammed it. They got out, stole the cash, put it in another 4x4. There was a high-speed rush back across these makeshift bridges and onto another area where there was more 4x4s waiting. The money was transferred and the gang split and went separate ways. It took the gang 5 minutes. The first Gardaí arrived at the Brinks Allied to respond to what had been going on, because of course the security were watching this live on the cameras and the CCTV as it was happening. But they took 8 minutes to get there.
Yeah.
And the gang were finished and done and gone in 5 minutes. So again, in this case, there was legitimate businessmen in Dublin, Northern Ireland and Britain used to launder that cash. 3 days after the robbery, the monk, as he was then being known, flew to the Canaries for certain meetings. But the thing about it was, you have Gary Hutch, sort of a bit of a wild teen with a lot of kind of history there, growing up surrounded by very interesting, colourful characters from organised crime and beyond. You have his own members of his family being very heavily involved in the Kelly organised crime grouping. and becoming their own operation. You have him, a teenager in Dublin, recognising and showing a huge interest in the e-scene. You have that change of drugs no longer just looking like they're for the sick. They're also for the really well-heeled and people who are partying and aren't addicted. They're just going out at the weekends. And at the same time as all this, you have his uncle losing his cherished anonymity and becoming the monk, this media celebrated criminal. And that definitely gives him, you know, it gives him some streets out in the city.
100%. And he also is surrounding himself with a group of people, all from the same area of North, all from the North Inner City, that these people, this is all in the late 90s, more than 25 years later, these people are still being written about all the time. His kind of childhood crew, including his cousin Christopher Bouncer Hutch, but it also includes people that are living just literally up the road from him in Hardwick Street flats. People like Ross Browning and Gary Finnegan in particular, and Gary Finnegan's cousin Barry Finnegan. Across, just slightly further up, there's a guy called Matthew Dunn on just off Dorset Street, who would also be arrested as part of Operation Shovel in 2010. Other people would be Paddy Doyle from Portland Row, another childhood teenage friend of Gary Hutch's. Paddy Doyle would be in a relationship with a cousin of Fat Freddie Thompson, again further connecting the organisations. And of course, another young man from the Sheriff Street area originally, known as James Mago Gately, who would also be sort of the younger member of that whole crew. All of these people were very regularly in and out of in particular, Neddy Hutch seems to have been in and out of his house a lot. He seems to have acted as a kind of a mentor for these guys. They are involved in, while ultimately many of these people go on to be known as major drug dealers. But at this stage, they're having involvement in all sorts of crime. Robberies, joyriding, you name it. But of course, it's those connections on the other side of the city that would put them into the stratosphere.
And where once the Liffey was a great divider, I think the Ecstasy dance culture perhaps was one of the reasons that sort of broke down, and you had friendships being created, between the Northsiders and the Southsiders. And of course, on the South Side, you had Daniel Kinahan and Christopher Kinahan Jr. Coming of age under this, huge character that was their father, Christy Kinahan Sr., who's this point in Amsterdam.
Yes.
And he's becoming a major wholesaler for ecstasy. So you have the coming together of what's essentially this next generation. You have familial ties, you have friendship ties, and you have ties that are going up to the fathers.
Yes.
Who have worked sort of side by side. They've crossed each other's paths in criminality. All maybe doing slightly different things, but all ultimately working to the same goal, which is making money illegally. And you have the emergence of what we'll call the Brat Pack for the purposes of the next part of this series. And in the heart of that Brat Pack are two people. There's Gary Hutch and there's Daniel Kinahan. And they'll go on to become best friends and bitter enemies. So we'll come back for part 2 and we'll see what happens next.
Yes, indeed we will.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.